Welcome back, or welcome if it's the first time that you are watching my YouTube channel, My Paranormal and Mystery TV. Misery, the cult movie released in 1990. In a few minutes we go to my personal computer because there are videos and above all a scandal deleted scene that many people have been waiting to watch for more than 30 years, or if you didn't know that this deleted scene existed, in few minutes you can watch it. And then there are really scary videos and thrilling curiosities to know. But first of all, Misery, a psychological thriller, for many people a horror movie, was released in 1990 based on the novel by Stephen King, Misery, released in 1987, directed by Rob Reiner, screenwriter William Goldman, starring James Caan, playing the role of Paul Sheldon. Then we have a sacred master of cinema, one of my favorite actresses ever. I'm talking about Kathy Bates, who played in more than a perfect way the psychopath Annie Wilkes, and in fact Kathy Bates won the Oscar for this movie as Best Protagonist Actress. In this movie, there was also the unforgettable Lauren Bacall, who played the role of Marcia Sindel. Then we have Richard Farnsworth, playing the role of Sheriff Buster, and many others. Curiosities! Let's talk about the scene. You know what I mean? I mean the hobbling scene. Think about that in the novel by Stephen King, this scene was much more crude and horrifying, even if when I think everybody, personally, when I watched Misery for the first time, I was a teenager, and when I watched that scene, the hobbling scene, I screamed, "Oh my gosh!" But think about that in the novel it was worse, because in the movie Annie Wilkes in the novel Annie Wilkes cut one of Paul Sheldon's feet off. There is the amputation and she cut this foot off with an axe. Instead, Because, I must tell you this, the screenwriter, William Goldman, loved this passage of the novel. And he wanted this passage into the movie. But he asked the director, Rob Reiner, to include this crude scene also in the movie Misery. But the director, Rob Reiner, insisted to change it. Because in the movie, Annie Wilkes crushes both the ankles of Paul Sheldon. And it's a terrible scene because she crushes both the ankles of Paul Sheldon with a hammer. And why this decision to change this so famous scene also in the novel? Because the director, Rob Reiner, wanted to make a film that was more a psychological thriller film than a pure horror movie. This is the reason why. And later, Goldman stated that Reiner's decision was the right one. And now, let's talk about the cast, because even if Misery has a perfect cast and the movie won an Oscar thanks to Kathy Bates, really a well-deserved Oscar, think about that the role of Paul Sheldon didn't go. The first choice wasn't James Caan, but the first choice was William Hart. And this part was offered to him twice, but he refused twice. Then other sacred masters of cinema. The other choices were Kevin Kline, Michael Douglas, Harrison Ford, Dusty Hoffman, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Richard Dreyfuss, Jenny Ackman, and Robert Redford, but all of them refused. So the role was James Caan, and I can tell you, and I think that you can agree with me, that he played perfectly the role of Paul Sheldon, the kidnapped writer. Then even Annie Wilkes wasn't the first choice. Oh my gosh, Kathy Bates wasn't the first choice. Think about it. The first choice was Angelica Houston, the mythical Morticia Addams in the 90s, and also Betty Midler, but they both refused. And so, fortunately, the role was Kathy Bates. Who could play better Annie Wilkes than Kathy Bates? Because it's a psychological thriller, but also a thriller horror film. And Kathy Bates, even if then you discover that Kathy Bates playing the role of Annie Wilkes, then you discover that she's a serial killer. She's so perfect that you admire her even if she's a serial killer, because she has that black humor, as when she crushes both the ankles of Paul Sheldon and then she says, "Paul, how much I love you," with the hammer. So really unique. And the film was absolutely a success, and it has become a cult. And think about that, Stephen King in the beginning was skeptical on a movie based on his novel Misery, but then he stated that Misery is one of his favorite film adaptations. And now, are you ready to watch these videos? Because I'm going to show you the scandal deleted scene. The main differences between the movie and the novel. I must tell you that I read the novel Misery, and I don't know how many times I watched this movie. And I can tell you that the novel has several differences from the film, so I tell you the main ones. And then, do you want to know the mystery of Misery and thrilling curiosities? I must warn you, spoiler, because I'm going, of course, I'm going to reveal you how the film goes on and how it ends. So if you haven't read the novel Misery by Stephen King and you are going to read it, or if you haven't still watched Misery, the film, I suggest you to watch the movie before watching this whole documentary. But otherwise, let's go! I start with the scandal deleted scene. Warning, some images could disturb the sensitivity of the viewers.
With perspiration. Your color is very hectic. What have you been doing? You dirty bird. How could you?
And now let's delve into the thrilling, creepy curiosities of Misery.
1990's Misery tells the tale of a famous writer, Paul Sheldon, Mr. James Caan, nearly dying in a car accident, being nursed back to health by a nurse named Annie Wilkes, the great Kathy Bates, who also happens to be
#1 fan and all.
And over the course of 107 minutes, Paul must figure out how to placate Annie, gain her trust, and eventually escape with his life. Now, as much as I want to talk about great moments like Paul shoving the burning script in Annie's mouth, to the small middle finger through the window, Or Annie giving her opinions on the institution of marriage with a jug of piss in her hands. No, but this time around, the most famous and iconic scene happens to be the one that defines it. Paul, using a hairpin, has been strategically sneaking out of his room, planning his eventual escape when he finds Annie's scrapbook. It's here we learn she was responsible for the deaths of many infants in her care at Eldridge County Community Hospital. We knew she was, off her rocker. But now we know to what extent Annie Wilkes is a serial killer. So Paul, being a wise man that he is, he's a writer, he plans his attack and awaits. But what he didn't realize is...
My little ceramic penguin in the study always faces due south.
Before he could launch his attack, he gets quickly drugged. And then he wakes up to the scene that brings us here today. The hobbling hits every beat that Misery has and does it to perfection. Paul wakes up from his doping, and he's not quite there. He's a little loopy. Well, we cut to a close-up of Annie, whose facial expression is both creepy and curious. She's tied up Paul, bound him to the bed, and things go from polite to desperate, with Paul trying to play any hand he has left. Deny, while feeling for his knife. Yet it's Bates's portrayal of Annie and her quintessential expressiveness that leads off to one of the best monologues.
If they caught them, they had to make sure they could go on working. The operation was called hobbling.
Listen, there's a reason she won an Oscar, and it's because of how damn emotive, unique, and precise she plays Annie. There's a true sense of innocence that's not an act. Throughout the movie, we get glimpses into Annie's bipolar nature, but she truly thinks of herself as good. There's a bit of that, specific Western United States hillbilly politeness. And what works so well is that she doesn't lose her shit, as she's done prior.
And now, let's delve into the hobbling scene.
Needs more time.
I realize you just need more time.
While she's going over how she found the hairpin as his key, and how all he needs is time, Khan gives a beautiful range of emotion, while Rob Reiner slowly dollies in. I mean, listen to Bates' tone. The tone of Annie when she's describing the Kimberley diamond mines.
Do you know what they did to the native workers who stole diamonds? Don't worry, they didn't kill them.
It's so pure and factual, set to the sweet and somber Moonlight Sonata. It's like she's reading a book report in 8th grade. Only this one ends with both your ankles smashed.
Hey, please!
As we get closer and closer to Paul's realization of the inevitable, he's already screwed, just waiting for it to finally happen. And as violent as it is in the book, with the amputation of the foot and the cauterization with the blowtorch, the sledgehammer seems far more sadistic. And let's be honest, it's all build-up. I mean, the scene is no more than 3-ish minutes, but we feel it. We feel it deep in our soul. And being that this was 1990, they show almost nothing. Just one ankle. Super quick. But everything else is punctuated by the bellowing screams of Paul, brilliantly executed by James Caan.
Paul
Had some freedom, as small as it was prior, but with the hobbling, he's now totally stuck and fully relying on Annie going forward. You see, the horror goes way deeper than just the pain. Now Paul is fully and maybe permanently at the mercy of his captor. As a wise...
What did inspire Stephen King?
That the initial inspiration for the book was the short story by Evelyn Waugh called The Man Who Liked Dickens, about a man in South America held prisoner and forced to read Charles Dickens stories. King wondered what it would be like if Dickens himself was the one who was held captive. While that may be the basis, the story of Misery is more personal than that, as King later admitted that the book was really about his battles with drugs and alcohol, with Annie Wilkes being the stand-in for his addictions, keeping the author hostage and damaging him physically and mentally. One could also surmise
Misery.
anyone who's read the book or seen the movie knows the story, which revolves around author and Stephen King's surrogate, Paul Sheldon. Paul's the author of a very successful series of cheesy romance novels featuring the protagonist, Misery Chastain. The books have made Paul rich and famous, but he's at a point where he despises writing them and yearns to move on to more serious literature. While driving through a snowstorm in Colorado, Paul crashes his car, totaling the vehicle and nearly himself. But he's rescued from certain death by nurse Annie Wilkes, who, as luck, bad luck that is, would have it, knows who exactly Paul is. Turns out she's his #1 fan. While tending to Paul, who is for all intents and purposes unable to communicate with the outside world, Annie finds to her great dismay that Paul has killed off her beloved Misery in what he plans on being the last of those books. But this will not do. No, no, no. And Paul goes from being Annie's patient to being her prisoner right quick.
Because if I die, you die.
In order to force him to write the book that she wants, she goes through extreme measures to ensure he can't get away. One measure being chopping off his foot. Great late-night reading material from the master of horror, sure, but would this claustrophobic two-hander make a good film? Turns out yes, an Oscar-winning film to boot.
A well-deserved Oscar for Kathy Bates.
Religious, and whether she was raised to be religious or came to find God in her own way throughout her life is unknown, but her faith does have a heavy impact on her life, referring to God in many different parts of the film, and using her connection to him as some of the reasonings behind her motivations. Another key trait of Annie's is her innocent and prudish behavior that we can attribute to either her upbringing, her religious beliefs, a combination of the two, or even her own personal preferences when it comes to speech, the way she dresses, and the way she conducts herself.
Annie is a nurse.
Desire within them to help and care for people. But when the person who carries these traits is someone like Annie Wilkes, they can be twisted to serve as justifications for the horrifying actions they take. Now that the film gives us insight into perhaps the most important part of Annie's psyche, her cruelty and her willingness to use extreme and sadistic methods to get whatever she wants. In the beginning we don't see much of this, bits of it only showing when her anger rises. But then we're treated to a look into her scrapbook where it's revealed that Annie is in fact a serial killer and has a long record of murder under her belt. It's revealed to us that Annie started killing at a young age. The first clipping in her scrapbook states that her father died from falling down the stairs when she was only 11 years old. Now for a split second you may think that Annie was just a witness to an unfortunate accident, but on the next page we find that the top nurse at her college met her own end in the very same way, indicating that Annie was responsible for both of these deaths. It's unknown why she killed her father, but we see in the scrapbook that once the top nursing student died, Annie replaced her at the top and graduated summa cum laude from her university. The next two murders recorded in her scrapbook are the deaths of a high school coach and a used car salesman during her time as the head of the intensive care unit at her hospital. What an odd coincidence. The next murder she commits is in service of furthering her own goals, just as killing the top student at her school had been. We see that the head pediatrician at the hospital she works at dies, and she is then subsequently promoted to head maternity nurse in the county. The next few pages show that Annie is then responsible for a number of infant deaths during her time as the head maternity nurse. This scrapbook is important for a number of reasons. It shows her to be cruel.
Oh my gosh! Cruel, ambitious,
and psychotic. But perhaps the most important thing we learn from this scrapbook is that Annie is a killer, and a killer with more than one motive. On the one hand, she kills people for her own gain, namely the top student at her university and the veteran pediatrician. But she also kills seemingly just for the sake of killing. Perhaps there are deeper motivations behind killing her father, the coach, and the car salesman, or even the killing of the infants. But we're only left to conclude that Annie kills these people just because she can. Perhaps aiming to be in these high positions she's put herself in just so she was able to kill as much as she'd like.
And now, scary curiosities, creepy videos, and the differences with the novel of Stephen King.
Oh, and that one scene really stood out. You know the one we're talking about. I could not effing believe it. Goldman went on to write in one of his memoirs, I knew she was going to tickle him with a feather, but I never dreamt such behavior was possible, and I knew I had to write the movie. Directing the film was originally going to be George Roy Hill, perhaps best known for directing the Best Picture winner, The Sting, in 1973. Hill had apparently agreed to do it at Reiner's behest, but when it came to that foot-chopping scene, he got cold feet, pun definitely intended, and dropped out. According to Goldman, Hill ended up saying, "I was up all night and just could not hear myself saying action on that scene." So concerning was the gruesome but pivotal scene that Reiner decided to take an informal survey of the people who worked at Castle Rock. Should the scene stay or go? Eventually the consensus was for it to stay in, but it would eventually get changed to make it slightly, just slightly, less horrifying. Reiner and producer Andrew Scheinman started doing their own drafts of the screenplay, and one of the key changes was that scene. The director decided to change it to Annie smashing Paul's foot with a sledgehammer. Not nice, not at all. It's graphic than the foot coming clean off thanks to an axe. Goldman initially was not pleased. He thought that they had ruined what was going to be the biggest standout scene in the movie. He couldn't convince them to go back to the source material, and later on would admit that he was wrong, and they were right. The thinking being that if Annie had chopped,
I'll take good care of you.
For one fan.
in preparing to play a serial killer, which is what Annie Wilkes is revealed to be, Bates read up on people like Ted Bundy and other killers who were able to blend into society while committing their heinous crimes behind closed doors. As fate would have it, Bates knew about Annie before becoming attached to the film, as a friend of hers some years prior had handed her a copy of Misery and said, "When they make a movie out of this, you should play Annie." Give that
The best.
When it came to shoot what would go on to become the film's most notorious scene, the hobbling, a pair of fake legs were made out of gelatin by K&B Effects Group, who would go on to become Hollywood's go-to makeup and gore wizards. James Caan was in a bed with holes cut out at the bottom where his real legs would go, while the prosthetic legs were attached at his knees. But shooting the scene, which both Bates and Reiner apparently found to be very unpleasant, would take a toll on the feet themselves, which began to get rubbery, prompting artist Howard Berger to eventually attach a wire to the fake foot, so he could hold it down after Bates whacked it with a sledgehammer. Another change in terms of gruesomeness was the death of the sheriff character, Buster, played by Richard Farnsworth. In the book, the sheriff is killed by Annie in a very Stephen King-like manner. She runs him over with a lawnmower. In the film, however, Buster is blasted in the back with a shotgun. Allegedly, Bates wanted the lawnmower scene in the movie, but Reiner was concerned it would look too silly on the big screen. So he opted for something a little more subtle. Or, I mean, as subtle as a shotgun blast can be. Misery was...
But which is the mystery, the secrets behind Misery? Stephen King will reveal you something I personally didn't know. Watch this.
Such a kidder. Come on, Misery.
Now, since I started
The premise of Misery.
broken up into two metaphors. The first one is about parasocial relationships long before the advent of the internet and the ubiquity of social media, where Annie, as a big fan of Paul's work, has built a psychological relationship where she feels she's emotionally connected to him on a personal level, despite never having actually met him until now. The thing was, Stephen King initially developed the story with this inherent creep factor in mind, and it gradually morphed into a broader critique of fandom. Paul Sheldon is basically a manifestation of how King felt at the time of writing the novel. To diversify his writing and develop something that his kids could read, in 1984, King released a fantasy novel called The Eyes of the Dragon, which, despite receiving positive reviews from critics, was largely panned by his fanbase, who were critical of its absence of horror elements. As a result, King channeled his frustrations of feeling trapped with the label of horror writer into, well, a horror novel. One that is both figuratively and very literally an encapsulation of his inability to feel free to write what he wanted and appease an entitled fanbase who subconsciously felt like they controlled him.
I never said that I was a horror novelist. I never said that I was a suspense novelist. I never said I was anything except a guy who writes books. Any labels that go on me, I don't accept those or reject those.
Now, I've always Paul finished the last installment of his best-selling romance series, where he kills off the titular character Misery, to which, after Annie reads it, deprives him of painkillers, food and water because she's livid at his actions and it doesn't fit the narrative that she wants. It's an aggressive yet interesting metaphor. On the one hand, Paul is trying to understandably move away from the thing that made him so successful because it does not creatively fulfill him and makes him miserable. Yet, on the other hand, because Annie, as the embodiment of his fan base, hates it, he's deprived of a living, as if he no longer deserves anything. It's a cutthroat relationship that results in Paul reviving the character and essentially pandering to Annie just to keep her happy. But even then, she still chastises him for plot details and things that don't fit what she wants. And Misery transcends beyond simply a man trapped in an obsessed fan's house, forced to write what she wants. You are actually in Paul Sheldon's head. You are experiencing his version of misery firsthand. It's a kind of love-hate relationship because there's this really twisted idea that his work technically saves him because a loyal fan was following him and able to help him, and the reason she has a purpose is because his work gives her so much meaning to comfort her. It's worth establishing that the conclusion of the book is much more tragic than the film. After finally killing Annie and escaping with his life, Paul returns to New York and publishes Misery's Return, the book which Annie forces him to write in order to revive Misery. And so he ends up right back where he started, destined to continue writing misery novels, much to his, well, misery. But he also suffers from post-traumatic stress, with frequent horrible nightmares about Annie, withdrawal from the abundance of painkillers she gave him, and he even becomes an alcoholic struggling with writer's block. So despite surviving, Paul's life has just gotten much, much worse. And while it does conclude with him finding inspiration for a new book, he's still consumed by his trauma. The film, on the other hand, is a little more basic about it. Paul comes home, has nightmares about Annie, but he seems to be coping okay, and is able to publish a potential career-changing new book, so it kinda undermines the central themes.
So, I want to thank you so much, my dear followers, viewers. See you soon. Stay tuned.